So I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think that when we see it rightly, obedience is a beautiful thing. When we don't see it rightly, though, obedience is not often perceived or felt as a great thing. So, David, jump on in here, brother.
Well, so I want to talk a little bit about the power and beauty of obedience-based discipleship, and I have my son's permission to share his story. So let me do that because it's the best way for me to talk about the beauty of it. When my son, who is now 24, when Jonathan was about 14 or so, he sat down with me on our deck, and he really wanted to tell me something, and he explained to me that he didn't think he believed in God anymore. So, I'm a pastor and I'm preaching every Sunday. This is a soul-crushing thing to hear. Although I already could tell, he was a little prayer warrior as a boy, but he developed severe depression and had depression for some years. And we thought, in fact, he had some symptoms of autism. And so he just really struggled. And the conversation essentially was him telling me that he respects me. He was not rebellious, and he thought the Christian religion had been good for humanity, but he just didn't really think there was a God. And he said something along the lines of he wasn't going to rebel against me, wanted to reassure me. And I told him, I said, well, okay. I said, here's the deal. I said, as long as you live in my house, you're going to act like a Christian. You got to live by Christian principles. You're going to go to church. But that wasn't an option. If you live in my house, you go. But then I said, but I can't make you believe. But I know God's not done with you. God is going to pursue you. He is going to chase you down, and God is going to catch you, and he's going to bring you back. And I'm going to pray that way every day until God does. And that began really a long ordeal with our son. Eventually graduated high school, and he went off to college. And we got a phone call about a year and a half after he was in college from his university. And we, as a family, we don't talk too much about the details of it. But let me just say this. We hadn't had a knife in our house in several years. John had been suicidal. And we were called to a hospital. And by the time we got there, he was in really bad shape. And he stayed in the hospital there at his university for about a week before we brought him home. And we brought him home. Julie and I really prepared for the worst. We actually had conversations about what we would do in the event of a suicide. He was in terrible shape, terrible. And the thing that rattled around in my head so much was, what had I done wrong? We had Bible studies with our kids every school morning. We had Bible studies. They led the Bible studies at times. He'd gone to a Christian school. He had sat through my preaching and gone to our church. We had a great youth ministry. I mean, every Christian opportunity you can give, we'd given him. And, you do a lot of soul searching when it's your own kid. And we did. We did a lot of crying and a lot of soul searching. Even now, it's hard to tell the story, but I think it's an important story. But one of the things that kind of struck me was some of the stuff that I've written about in the book is, had I modeled obedience to Jesus? So much of my ministry was built around trying to build a church. I wanted to increase the attendance. I wanted the budget to go up. A lot of it, I think, was wrapped up in all of that. And in the process, I'm not sure I was even asking the right questions, about about people's well-being in Jesus, and are they really following Jesus? And had I spent all my time trying to build a church instead of trying to help my own son trust and follow Jesus as a disciple? And in the soul searching, we just went through a lot of changes. Actually, Renee was part of all this. That North Boulevard just started rethinking who we are as a church. I can tell you we're not nearly where I wish we were, but we are a long way from where we once were. And I just began to notice the more we really said we're going to trust Jesus, we're going to obey Jesus, the more the miracles started happening. And it just dawned on me that if you want Acts 2 miracles, you have to first practice Acts 2 obedience. And that's where I think we faltered so much, is we all want the miracles of the New Testament church, but we don't want to have to obey the New Testament to get there. And Jesus is attracted to obedience. He's attracted to sacrifice. He's attracted to people who are not convinced they have to do it their way. He's attracted to people who are convinced they're going to do it his way. And when we step out in faith, when we trust him, when we really make obedience to Jesus the thing, he pours miracles out on us. So in the last chapter of the book, I tell quite a few miracle stories, and it's a delight to tell them. Again, with Renee on the phone, she knows a lot of these intimately. She's right in the middle of some of them. We wanted to make disciple making the main thing and plant churches and start a school to think Christianly. We had all these plans as a church, and we just decided, okay, we need $1.6 million. This is one of the miracle stories. We prayed, we sacrificed, we went out, we worked, we recruited, spent 6 months trying to get this. And on Giving Sunday, when we were just begging God, please, 1.6, and I didn't think we'd even get that. When the final tally came in, what was committed was 6.1, the exact reverse of what we were asking for. $6.1 million, not given to a building, given to people wanting to make disciples and plant churches around the world. We said we'll plant 60,000 churches, and none of us really believed it, but we just like, all right, let's just try something so big. If it happens, we know God did it. And the church just poured it out. They just poured it out. Just over and over again, you see that when you actually make these big God-sized acts of obedience, all of a sudden God just gives you all the energy and the power and these miracles that you want. And so I really want to focus on that last sentence of Jesus is, behold that I'm with you. Look at me, I'm with you. And I think we have a stunted view of miracles in the 21st century. A lot of our churches are fully cessationist. That is, everything that is important in terms of miracles and acts of God, it all stopped at the first century. But you just need to know that, first of all, your definition of miracles was probably given you by an atheist. The modern definition of miracles that most churches use today, it comes from David Hume, an atheist philosopher, a Scottish philosopher. And Hume is the one who said that providence is when God works through nature. A miracle is when God works contrary to nature. Well, you just need to know that's not in the Bible. That's nowhere in the Bible. That was given to us by a Scottish atheist philosopher, and now all of a sudden we believe it. In the Bible, the phraseology you get is this: God works signs, wonders, and powers. And listen to that: signs, wonders, and powers. A sign is when God does something that points you to something else. When did God stop doing that? He still does things to point us to other things. In fact, if you want to note one, every time you see a rainbow, that's still a sign from God. God is still doing signs. He's still doing signs. A wonder is anything that makes your jaw drop. It's when you wonder at something, oh my goodness, I can't believe God did that. God has always done wonders. He still does wonders. They're all around us. But they are mostly seen only by people who are obeying him. A power is anytime God acts with extraordinary strength to do something amazing, to do something big. When you ask for 1.6, you work your tail off and 6.1 comes in, that's a power. God has always done powers. He always will do them. He won't stop. Signs, wonders, and powers are still available for the obedient. And they are they're the beauty. They're the power that we need in order to obey these texts. Who are we to obey Jesus? Who are we but broken people? We have no power to live the life that God has called us to live, but he gives us the power when we obey. And I think it's almost like gravitational proportionality, whatever the gravitational formula is, that your obedience is directly related to the kind of miracles you'll experience. Here, let me give you an example. So we have a young guy who's 16. He's not 16 now, but he was 16 2 years ago. And my wife's on the board of a children's home in Africa. And they were trying to raise $50,000 to add to the children's home because when the kids reach 5, they age out. The children's home only has room for X number of kids, and at age 5, so you have all these kids with no place to go, and in many cases, no parents. And this very, very poor area in Tanzania. So my wife says, let's just pray for $50,000, and she gets this guy because she's kind of mentoring this young 16-year-old guy, and she gets the two of them start praying. They never asked for a penny, never asked for a penny. They prayed, and they got a group of people praying. And within 3 weeks' time, they had $50,000 in hand. So they thought, well, that worked pretty well. So then they have all these mamas who can't produce milk because of nutritional problems, starvation, essentially. These mamas of babies who are starving to death. So they decided we're going to raise $60,000 more to buy formula to send over there for mamas who can't produce milk for their babies, whose babies are literally starving to death. So this time they go out, and this young man's name is Adam. I have permission to tell the story. He's got $20. So he prays over his $20. And he goes to the youth ministry, says, I got $20. I want to raise $60,000. It's a 16-year-old kid. The youth minister says, well, I'll put 500 in. And he says, can I make an announcement? So he makes an announcement. They raise $1,700 more. But two different families said, well, we'll put in $500 each. So now they're up to over $3,000. Then there's a business person in there that says, hey, look, whatever you raise tonight, I'll match it. So now they're up to almost $9,000, a 16-year-old with $20. Then some corporation hears about it and says, how much do you need? In a matter of 2 more weeks, they had raised $60,000 more, $110,000 total. I'm talking to the young guy's name is Adam about it, and he says, yeah, I never thought $20 would ever produce $60,000. But the answer to that is, it does when you obey, and that's a miracle. And you may say, so our definition of miracles is when 2 plus 3 equals 6, and that would be a miracle. But let me tell you, it's also a miracle if 2 plus 3 equals 5 and you had neither a 2 nor a 3 to start with. That's a miracle too. So some mama in Tanzania is saying to the Lord, God, please help my starving baby. And I got a 16-year-old boy here who sends her a check for $60,000 worth of formula. And I'm telling you, for her, that's a pretty awesome miracle. When you obey, God does his best work. That's when we start to see God all around us. I had knee surgery last year, just a torn meniscus. And we have a guy who does visiting for us in church, one of our deacons. And he came in at 7 o'clock. He's visiting me at the hospital. I said, how's it going? He said, oh, it's going great. He said, man, we had 4 miracles this week. I was like, 4 miracles this week? 4 miracles this week. They went and prayed over a guy on hospice, an 80-something-year-old man. They took him off hospice the very next day. They had a woman who had gone septic, was in the hospital in ICU. They prayed over. The next day, she's out of the hospital. We had a baby that had, I don't remember what the baby had, meningitis, I think it was. They prayed over the baby. The baby came out in 5 days, was out of the hospital, is fine. The baby's fine now. This was a year ago. Baby's doing great. And then he named one other. Right now, it's not coming to me. But he just says this, and I thought to myself, it's not bad to belong to a church where you get 4 miracles before breakfast even happened. I'm just saying, it's all around you. Jesus is all around us. But he's working for the obedient. I'm not suggesting he ignores the disobedient, but I'm saying if you want to see what he does, step out there in obedience, and then you get the power that you needed and the beauty of it. All right, so I know I've talked a lot. I'm going to finish up with this one because this is my son's story.
No, this is good.
My son came home. We put him in his bedroom, and Jonathan stayed in his bedroom for about a week. Literally didn't even come down to eat. We took the food up to him. He was in really bad shape. And we had, by sheer coincidence, again, it's so fun to have you on the call, Renee, because you know I'm not making this up, even though I put a nice spin to it. You know I'm not making any of it up. You were there watching the whole show. Well, not watching, you were orchestrating half of it. She was the director of all the vision. We had hired this guy he's an American raised in a Korean home, and he was second in command to Junri, the founder of Taekwondo. He's a Taekwondo grandmaster, and he wanted to go into ministry, and we brought him to North Boulevard. It was a different denomination. There was no reason this should ever have happened. And we brought him on North Boulevard. Nobody knew what he could do. He didn't know what he could do. But what he says is, all this is coordinated. When he finds out my son's like this, he says, can I take your son out to lunch? I said, yeah, if you can get him out of his room. And I even told him, I said, look, my son's suicidal. So his name's Ken. Ken takes my son out, John. And next thing I know, every morning, John's getting up and going somewhere. And I said, John, where are you going? He said, I'm meeting with Ken. I said, oh. So I asked Ken about a week later, what are you doing with my son? Ken said, I promised him a black belt in Taekwondo if he would give me 2 hours every day of the week for the next 6 months. And Ken said the fastest black belt ever earned in Taekwondo was by Tony Robbins, the motivational speaker, in 6 months. Ken says, I'm going to give your son a black belt in 5 months and 29 days, giving him the fastest earned black belt, but he's got to give me 2 hours a day, every day of the week for the next 6 months. I said, if you can do it, man, go for it. But here's what I didn't know. Ken was doing everything Matthew 28:18-20 says. He was discipling my son. He was praying with my son. He was teaching my son to see Jesus. He was following the Matthew 28 plan. And I can't describe the change that started happening over my son. Halfway through, they called me in to show me John's breaking boards and, with his feet and his head and all that flying through the air. It was really cool to see. And right at the end, Jonathan and one other who is also training were asked by Ken to put their hands on their fathers and pray. So John puts his hands on me and starts praying. And I broke down and I started sobbing. And when we got home, I said to John, I can't believe you prayed. John doesn't pray. I can't believe you prayed over me. And John goes, he said, well, I don't know that I believe in God yet, but Ken made me do it. And so I did it because I'm obedient. Obedience is really important in Taekwondo. But in 6 months, John gets his black belt. We all go to the show. The program isn't where he does all of his breaking boards and all this sort of stuff. And then Ken gives him the microphone, and John looks me in the eye in the microphone. He says, Dad, do you remember the conversation we had 6 years ago? And I said, I do remember. And then John says, well, I want you to know I'm back. And I believe Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and he is my Savior. My son, Ken, took his own black belt off, the black belt Ken first earned, and he wrapped it around my son. Today, my son is in Eugene, Oregon, planting a church. Jonathan has baptized half of his high school friends. He went back to his college and baptized his college roommate and the guys that he was with during the most troubled times of his life. And he is doing wonderful. And what I'm here to say is that's power. That's the beauty of obedience-based discipleship. All the stuff I might have given my son didn't matter until someone entered his life and brought the love of Jesus and said, we can do this and change his life. So that's what I want to say. Is that's God's faithfulness. That's something to behold. That's who King Jesus is.
That's really good. What you just described, David, just as a point of reference, is the end of Matthew 28 when he says, behold, I'm with you always.
That's right.
So that's good.
And I need you to ask Renee, did I make anything up, Renee?
No, you did not make anything up. It's all true. Verified.
Anything you'd like to add?
Well, me?
Yeah.
Yes. I think that our culture in particular gets really caught up with thinking the right things. So in child psychology, there's a principle that says in children, actions precede beliefs. So in other words, you can expect your 3-year-old to sit on their bottom in a chair at dinner before they understand why or actually believe it. But in adults, typically beliefs precede action. And I think at least part of what Jesus meant when he said that you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven unless you become like a little child is that principle at work. That as a grown adult, even when I don't understand it, I submit to the rule of Christ in my life, and I do the things that I do not want to do. Even if they don't make sense, even if they're hard and they hurt, that action many times will precede the full understanding. The obedience is the thing. And you will. It's such a fun journey. It's like not making the medicine go down. It's the behold moments. It's the amazing, exciting journey you get to go on when you go all in like that.
That's good. Ben, how about you?
I'm sitting here so encouraged by David's stories of miracles that I'm reluctant to share anything. I just don't want to. I had some stuff on my mind, but it's just not even worth bringing up.
Wow.
I don't want to take away from that. That was just fantastic. And I will say this: I do appreciate David, your vulnerability, even about I'm a father and my son is the same age as your son, and so he hadn't had some of the the same issues, but I often as a parent am always worried, how well am I doing? And I have a 26-year-old, a 24-year-old, and a 21-year-old, and I want to be a great father. And so I do appreciate you sharing that about your son, and also just the love and care and concern that you as a father have demonstrated, which is being a disciple maker in your own home, which is the priority. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. The underlying thing that David's getting at here, and like us to just make it explicit, is that you cannot do God-honoring, life-changing, disciple-making in the flesh. You can try to do it, but real life-changing, where people's lives are really changed, God's really honored, and it's a God thing, like what you just described, David. It's a work of God through us. Now, there's the two parts we've been talking about. There's the obedience, and then God responds. In fact, maybe we can talk a little bit about this, and here's the principle. It's a lot of times God doesn't act until we obey.
That's right.
So
Yep.
The Israelites coming into the promised land wasn't until they put their foot in the water that the water stops. And oftentimes life is like that. Am I quoting you right there, David?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, in fact, philosopher John Searle told a story to illustrate intelligence, was his point, but it's a great illustration for obedience as well. He says, imagine that you're sent into a room, so it's an imaginary experiment, and you're handed a stack of cards, and there are black ink marks on the cards. They don't mean anything to you. They're just black ink marks. And you're given a sequence that you're supposed to lay the black cards out. So you lay all the black cards out. And then they bring in a Chinese woman. And she looks at the cards with the black ink on them, and she starts sobbing. Because what you didn't realize is you were actually composing, by laying these cards out, the world's most beautiful Chinese poem. And when she saw it, she burst into tears because she was so moved by it. Now, Searle is saying that's how intelligence, he was talking about intelligence, but I think it's a great illustration for obedience, which is this. Paul says this in Ephesians chapter 2. He says we are God's workmanship. And in Greek, the word there for workmanship is it's the word for poetry. We're God's poetry. When we obey, we may not understand what the ink on that card means, or what the ink on this card means, or what the ink on this card. But then at some point we look back and we realize, oh my goodness, God just made a poem out of my life. But if I'm hard-hearted and disobedient, I never lay the cards out because they don't make sense to me. And I need God to make sense to me. And I'm just suggesting, when is God's ways your ways anyway? Why should God make sense to us? What does make sense? There's nothing in this world makes sense to me. I mean, God or no God, none of it makes sense to me. But why not trust myself to a God who then when I look back, I can see, oh my goodness, now I know exactly what God was up to. Hey, we had a guy, you met him, Bobby. He's a high school basketball coach. And Steve is a big disciple maker. Does a lot of disciple making. I found out about Steve because he had read one of our books. And I met with Steve, and he had some disciples. So he works at college campuses. His vision is to have a disciple-making movement on every university in the state of Tennessee. So I met with a group of his college kids. I call them kids. And they're building a discipleship house in Nepal, India. And I was like, why Nepal? And they said, well, because it's the hardest place to do it. And I was like, okay, whatever. So I said, how's it going? They said, well, we need $18,000 more. And I said, I'll tell you what you do. Come to my church this Sunday. We won't ask for any money, but let me just introduce you. So they came to church. I said to them, y'all stand up. In the sermon, here's some of his college kids. They need $18,000 to build a children's home in Nepal. I mean, no, not children's home, a discipleship house in Nepal. And I just thought the rest of y'all ought to know. He had $18,000 in his hands before he left that day because the church just wanted to respond. But here's the cool thing. We were having a university lunch on our ground, in our building. So I said to them, hey, your students, let's go back. I need to go to this lunch anyway. So we go back. There's like 200 people back in our gym eating lunch. We sit down at a table. We just randomly all pick a table. We sit at a table randomly. I didn't know who the people were at the table. And I've got these kids who are raising money for Nepal. We sit down and we introduce ourselves. These are 3 guys visiting for the first time at North Boulevard, never been to Murfreesboro in their lives. 2 of them were medical doctors and one of them is an engineer, and all 3 are from the country of Nepal. I'm not making that up. So we now have a discipleship house in Nepal from raising the money. And again, it's because they said, we think God has called us to do this. We don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to be obedient to the call. God not only gave them the money in one day, he connected them to medical doctors who are Christians in Nepal, all in one day.
Wow.
If they had been disobedient to the vision, it had never happened. And just obedience is where you get the miracles. That's where the fun stuff starts. But again, most of us aren't trained to obey. We're distrustful of obedience. We think it's legalism, or we think that obedience is the opposite of faith, or we're just really arrogant at the end of the day. We want it our way.
Yeah, let's come to that in just a second and talk about the barriers to obedience. Renee, I just wanted to give you a chance to jump in here on this conversation. You've obviously seen some of the things David's talking about. Would you like to add anything?
Well, it's been so fun seeing it happen. It's been so beautiful to use the word breathe and behold everything that God is doing in and through his people. It's beautiful. There's nothing more fulfilling than to run alongside with all that God's doing. Yeah.
That's good. Well, let me bring up this question. Why is it that obedience is not the thing that's normally emphasized? Ben, I'm going to draw you in as a pastor of a church. And why is it that we don't often see obedience as a beautiful thing and as this great thing to do?
Right. I think I'll give you another analogy, and I hate to keep going back to West Point, but I'll go back to just using West Point as an example. You get there and everything is about obedience. Everything is about discipline. And so what happens is you create a culture of obedience where disobedience looks dysfunctional. And so obedience becomes the standard of the group or the community. And I agree with there being a power and beauty to it. I played on the football team. We would play teams that were bigger than us, stronger than us. But most teams did not want to play us because there was a great chance that they would lose, because I played on a team where outside of football, there was a culture of obedience and discipline, and it just transferred to being on the field of play. And what I mean is that to be disobedient in that culture, you just stood out as odd. And I think sometimes, like in churches, that disobedience can become the culture. And so it becomes very difficult for people to be obedient and to step outside. And so what I hear a little bit, it seems like what David is sharing about his church is that it's not just an individual obedience, is that there's been a shift in the church where there's an expected culture to obey. And so the miracles then are a blessing to that church as a whole, because it's being an obedient group of people. And to answer your question shortly, obedience is just very challenging. And I know as a leader, if I'm not being obedient, I'm certainly not going to talk about it. I'm certainly not going to expect it and preach about it and teach about it, because that would be a dysfunctional perception of just of hypocrisy. So I think that's why it's challenging within a group of people in a church, trying to move everybody to where it's a culture.
So in this last 15 minutes, I wanted to take some time with each of you. And by that, I mean David, Renee, and Ben. Bill Hull had to leave early, so he's not with us for this last part. But I'd like to talk about some practical recommendations, encouragements, and exhortation of the things that we've been talking about, how that can make a real difference in our lives. So, David, let me turn to you and ask you to take just a few minutes and describe what are some key things that you think are important for people to do as they leave this time together.
There we go. Well, let me say this. I think one of the easy on-ramps for really moving to the next level in our faith is to decide to start discipling somebody. And I want to make sure that you know it's not for the elite, it's not for the professionals, but that the reason the Christian faith exploded in the first couple of centuries was the simple fact that every single person thought that I have the right and the privilege to make disciples. Bobby, you and I have worked with Shadonke Johnson and New Harvest Ministries in Sierra Leone. And they've gone from, he had 6 churches 15 years ago. And now, I don't know what the number is. It's in the tens of thousands. And the work that they also work with New Generations. New Generations has now planted over 70,000 churches, or facilitated the planting of it in 15 years. And, you know, they're always asked, what's the secret? Everybody wants to know the secret and so forth. And there's a lot of things they do that are probably different from Western churches. They really depend on God. Prayer is prayer is the water of the church, is what they drink. But at the end of the day, the thing that's really different is every single person there has the audacity to make a disciple of their next door neighbor, and they don't give up until they do. And so my first statement to any of you who is here is ask 2 or 3 people, 3 to 5, if you will, to join you in a year-long journey of making disciples. There's a real simple rhythm to it. Bobby, I think one of your resources that's on the bookstore gives 7 good rhythms to how to make disciples. Anybody can do it. I use this illustration a lot. My son, Jonathan, learned to read when he was 4 years old. He was really good at it. He's a sharp kid anyway. But the reason he learned to read is because his sister was 5 and a half and she was in kindergarten and she was learning to read. And she saw it was so much fun for her to teach Jonathan that, the rest of us are all busy. So she would teach Jonathan what she had just learned in kindergarten when she got home. So here's my answer. What does a 4-year-old need in order to learn to read? And the answer is he doesn't need a PhD. He just needs a 5-year-old who cares. And I know you're 5 years old. I mean, no matter what you are, you're 5. Find 3 to 5 folks that will sit down with you and start pouring yourself into them. And a lot of the rest of the things will start to come because you put yourself in a position where you have to start walking in obedience, putting yourself in a position where you start to have to trust God for the things you can't do. It's a jump start for a lot of things. Start discipling. You can do it.
That's really good, David. By the way, I'm going to go ahead and mention where to get that resource. If you go look at the bookstore, which is to the far right, there's a tab there, the bookstore. And if you scroll down in the bookstore, you're going to see it's a free download. It's called Starting a Discipleship Group Using the Teachings of Jesus. And I always tell people that's like, if you don't know what to do, do that. Now, there may be better ways to do. Your church may have better ways. And if they do, then God bless you, go there. But in the absence of another model, that's a model that we know works. And so we would commend it to you, where you can get, like David said, 2 to 4 other people and just invest in them. Would be a great thing to do. Ben, how about you?
Great question. It's similar to what David had just shared. I wrote down, when you were asking us this, I wrote down click share. Like a lot of times in our social media stuff, you can share everything nowadays. You could share your whole life. And I was thinking that what we can immediately do is share. Then as soon as I thought about that, I go, well, what do you need to know or in order to share appropriately? And I just look back here at the Great Commission. I know we started at the all authority, but I read the verse before that, at verse 17, where it says when, 16 and 17, Jesus brought them to the mountain, and it says they worshiped him and some doubted. So even when he was given the commission to those 11 apostles, some of them doubted. And so they wasn't necessarily where they need to be. That didn't stop him for giving the Great Commission. And so I don't think people have to be perfect, or, we're going to have doubts, but we still can go do it.
That's good. That's really good. Renee?
Mm-hmm.
Well, why did you make me go last? Those are good answers.
Hey, because all day you've been having so much wisdom all day.
Like, what can I add to that? That's so good. It's so true. I'll just say it again then, that perfect is the enemy of good.
Yeah.
The former perfectionist. Perfect is the enemy of good. Just try it. And I get you a few people. You don't know who it is? Ask God to show you who to invite. I had a weird little combo of a group because I just started asking God, who should I invite? Who should be a part of it? And you're right, Ben. Like, even when we have our doubts, even when we're like, oh, this is hard. And my life was really good before I got involved with all of y'all and like all your stuff. And, all those things are barriers. But like, I'm just here to say, like, for me, it's just, again, doing it was the thing. Was just, it was the thing. It was the best feature. So yeah, I just say I agree with you all. Those are great resources. And my groups were kind of clunky at first, and I didn't do all the elements you suggested. That's okay. We still made progress.
That's exactly right.
And I can turn them out to go do it themselves. And so, yeah, God takes our little puny mustard seed of faith and does stuff with it.
Yeah.
That's good. So in just a minute, David, I'm going to have you lead us in a closing prayer. And if you have any last comments before you pray, that's great. I would like to say just a few words for everybody who's with us, including those who will be watching the recording later, because you may not have access to what we're calling the bookstore. So the first thing is, I just want to encourage everybody, spend some time with David Young's book. It really is a good book. It really frames it well. It'll help your church and your friends and other people to frame and understand these things well. So I want to encourage you with that. Secondly, I want to encourage you to keep a part of the conversations that are going on with Discipleship.org and Renew.org, because in Discipleship.org, you have an organization focused on Jesus' methods of disciple making, and in Renew.org, you have an organization focused on Jesus' teachings for disciple making. And so you've got a great combination there. If you can keep up with the newsletters and keep up with the conferences, both organizations have gatherings coming up where you're going to just be encouraged in what we call the discipleship lifestyle. And that's being disciples who make disciples, and that we see our life through that lens, that we are disciples of Jesus every day. And every day we care about making disciples with Jesus, because we know at the end of our lives, nothing will matter more than the people that God has used us to help be a part of this journey to stand before him. Then the other thing, the third thing I do want to shamelessly encourage everybody to do, just because it's so helpful, is go to renew.org, download the Starting a Discipleship group using the teachings of Jesus. If you did those three things and you started a group, even like Renee said, everybody stumbles and falls, and there are no perfect disciple makers. I became really aware of that a few years ago when I was with Robert Coleman, who 55 years earlier had written the book, The Master Plan of Evangelism, which is the gold standard on disciple making. And he turned to me one day and he said, I'm still learning every day how to make disciples. And I thought to myself, if Robert Coleman in his late 80s is saying that, then that's good, because I'm still learning every day. And I get better every day, but I still got a ways to go. And that's true of everybody. And God will use your efforts because your efforts are honoring to him. So David, we're going to turn it over to you to bring it to a close.
Sure. Lord, what an honor it is to be together and to have this time together. I'm grateful, Father, for Renee and for Ben and for Bill and Bobby and for all the people who joined us, humbled and honored. And I do ask you, Father, to help us to love Jesus enough to follow him and to be obedient to him, to lift him up as King, not only in our lives, but to remind the world that the entire universe has a King, and it's King Jesus, and that he offers for us a better way than any way we might try ourselves, and that he's also coming back to consummate his kingdom and to restore us to the place you intended us to be in the very beginning, and that is in sweet and full communion with you. Help us to live consistent with that and to be ambassadors of that message until he comes. And it's in the name of Jesus I pray. Amen.